This evening at this meeting, which is part of Journalism Week, we have two unusual and excellent speakers who will present two phases of the mass communications field to us. I will ask Dr. Dario Palatella of the journalism faculty to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Palatella.
Time magazine, at its April 9th issue, named the comic strip Miss Peach as one of the great new comic strips in the country. Time described it as having mega-cephalic, super-sophisticated school tots who show up their elders' ignorance. Miss Peach is seen in the Indianapolis News and 200 other newspapers around the country. It is distributed nationally by the Newspaper Publishers Syndicate of Chicago. Her creator is Mel Lazarus, who will tell you all about her on this 3-by-4-foot drawing board on the stage. But before he brings Miss Peach into the auditorium, let's hear something about him. Mel is a native-born New Yorker who began drawing cartoons at the age of 16. Miss Peach was born at age 30. In between, Mel served in the Navy in 1945. Then for 5 years, he was art director and editor of children's and semi-slick magazines. He published his first novel in 1964. It was called The Boss is Crazy, Too. Right now, he is working on a stage adaptation for David Merrick, who will produce it as a musical comedy. At the same time, Mel is working on a television pilot film for Screen Gems. He has a second play coming along based on The American Way of Death, and this fall, a second novel will be published. In his spare time, Mel Lazarus hobbies with subminiature photography and golf. Let's welcome Mel Lazarus and Miss Peach.
Thank you. I also sell fancy groceries and officiated initiations. Thank you all for inviting me here this week, giving me two very unusual opportunities, one of which is, of course, seeing Ball State. And incidentally, I never dreamed so many people were interested in glass blowing. But the other opportunity, of course, was seeing Muncie, Indiana for the first time. At least I think I saw Muncie. I did notice something between the airport and the school. I presume that was it. If there's any doubt, I hope it wasn't for your sake. At any rate, I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the comic strip industry, its vicissitudes, its joys, but mostly about its vicissitudes, which means problems. Mainly because the joys are not, they're just ordinary joys, your average homegrown garden variety joy, the joy of short hours, the joy of being paid enormously, the joy of having your name in 200 newspapers every day, the ordinary things. You're more interested, I'm sure, in its pain, its frustrations, its aggravations, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on because that's what I think about most. Before I get to that, though, Dr. Palatella, I noticed, used the word novelist in his very lavish introduction to me, and it's my favorite word, see, especially when it's applied to me. I wasn't always a novelist. It's something brand new for me. For 22 years, I've been a cartoonist. But if a novelist is a person who's put 90,000 words together in some semblance of comprehensibility, then I am indeed a novelist. But I wasn't always one. I was always a cartoonist, as I say, for 22 years. And for the past 8 of those 22 years, I've been a particular kind of cartoonist. A rotten one. No. I've been a comic strip artist. After working at it for the first couple of years, I suddenly realized that I was managing to accommodate this work very comfortably and 2 or 3 days a week, which is, okay, I'm not complaining. But being your average middle-class neurotic, little guilt feelings began to creep in on me. How much golf can you play? How much sleeping can you do, especially during the afternoon? To make matters worse, my neighbors began to worry about me. They knew what I did for a living, and they approved more or less. But gee, seeing me around all the time, the other husbands were worried especially. My children made excuses for me. They had to explain me to the other kids. I didn't go to work every day like, the regular daddies. My oldest daughter said very recently she suggested there's something definitely wrong with a man who stays home with the squaws while all the others are out hunting, and sometimes even working. Finally, I made a terrible mistake. I decided to confide my feelings to my wife. Now, you never do that. You never confide your feelings to your wife, because she promptly came up with a choice of solutions which were destined to change my life. A, she said, clean up the basement on a regular 9 to 5 daily basis. Or B, build that extra room out in back of the house that I've been promising her. Or C, write that goddamn novel you've been talking about writing for the past 10 years. Well, I picked C immediately because it sounded easier than A or B. I had been talking about writing a novel. Everybody does, for that matter. The idea originally occurred to me a lot of years ago, I guess about 10 or 12 at that point, when I was working as an editor. Incidentally, as an editor, I had the distinction of throwing Jules Pfeiffer out of our office because he couldn't draw. It had seemed to me during those 5 years that the office atmosphere in which I worked would have made a pretty funny background for a comic novel. I thought of the characters with whom I'd worked, the boss who was a complete, he was a complete lunatic. He had a great sense of humor and a sadistic streak to match. And his business manager, whose job it was as watchdog of the Treasury to keep us from stealing, see. And he didn't do very well at that. We were much too smart for him. We were much too experienced. I thought of the subhuman circumstances under which we were required to work. The office with the tiny little window that opened out on an air shaft in Manhattan, in which lived every pigeon that ever flew over that island, or the hundreds of little comedic situations that would occur in any large office, the intra-office romantic affairs, which were always interesting, the ridiculous salaries. Well, I knew then, basically, what I was going to write. The second problem was, can I write? Could I write? Did I know how to write? Well, yes, I answered, very defensively. I always answer myself defensively. I said, yes, I had, in fact, been writing all those years that I'd been doing Miss Peach, because you have to write a comic strip before you can draw it. Something most people don't seem to realize. Well, I guess they just don't think about it. At that time, a company called the Dial Press was about to publish a collection of Miss Peach cartoons, an anthology, and the president, Richard Barron, invited me to lunch. We had never met before, and during the course of that lunch, he very casually asked me if I had ever thought about writing a novel, and I said yes. He said, have you got anything on paper? And I said yes. I lied, see, which I frequently do where money is concerned. He said, can I see it? And I said, you certainly. I want to remind you also that having lunch with a publisher and having him ask you if you're writing a novel is a very intoxicating situation, particularly if you've both had a couple of martinis. I said, yes, I have something on paper, and yes, you can see it tomorrow. And thus we parted. That night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm sitting at the typewriter with a blank piece of paper in front of me, wondering, castigating myself for my impetuousness of that afternoon, wondering why, gee, I've got to produce something for this guy. Then I remembered an axiom of the comic strip business, which was told to me by one of my colleagues, a fellow who writes one of the best-known so-called human interest comic strips in the country, the Mary Worth type of thing. I don't want to mention the name of the feature. And he told me that his technique was as follows. You see, they work in 13-week stories, unlike myself, who works in a gag a day. 13-week stories, and in order for him to get the reader's attention during the first week of any new continuity, any new sequence, he would institute all the suspense-engendering devices and gimmicks he could think of. The hand coming out from behind the curtain with the gun, the stranger in the shadows, the anonymous letter, all the old tricks. half of which he never bothered to resolve at the end of the story. But it didn't matter because the reader had, by that time forgotten about them. The main thing, of course, was to get the reader involved and let the characters carry him from there. Well, this is exactly what I did to poor Mr. Barron the next day. That night I wrote the first 27 pages of the most idiotic plot I could invent, and I peopled it with caricatures, really, of these nutty characters that I had worked with, and I threw in a lot of zany plot ramifications that I didn't worry about, resolving, because I didn't think he was going to like the book anyway. And I sent it over to him the next morning. Well, apparently it worked, because about 2 days later, his editor called me, and he said, Mel, you've written the beginning of a very funny novel. I said, thank you, Jim. He said, do you mind if we talk to your agent about it? I said, not at all. Do you know a good one? He said, would you like to get together and talk to me about what you're going to do for the next 250 some odd pages that you're going to have to write? And I said, I'm sorry, Jim, I never discuss my work before it's finished. And he said, it's okay, it's perfectly all right, I understand. He said, now how much time do you think you need to complete this work? I was thinking, I was about to say, ask him if 3 weeks would be too long, when he said, do you think you can finish by November, which was 9 months off. And I said, November? Hell, I could write 9 books between now and November. He said, well, just write one and we'll all be happy, see? Well, I overshot that due date by over a year, actually. It took me a year and 9, year and 10 months. Mainly because I had given myself an absolutely insoluble plot. And I had to resolve it, you see. No one was going to do it for me. It happened that the story was financially oriented because it was about a swindle. And my accountant had to work with me to help me through the technicalities. And even he didn't understand the book when he read it. The only place it really did well, or relatively well, was New York City, because that happens to be the center of the magazine publishing business and my enormous family. I even got a quote from Joe Heller, who wrote Catch-22. He said, and I'm very proud of this, he said, Mel Lazarus is the second funniest writer in America and has written the second funniest novel, the first presumably being him. 3 weeks ago, a friend of mine named David Gantz, who was about to have a book published by Putnam, asked me if I would give him a quote for his book, the back of the jacket kind of thing. And after, flogging my sincerity for hours, I finally came up with, David Gantz is the third funniest writer in America and has written the third funniest novel. And it's, if you kind of project into the future, the vagaries of this business being what they are, it's conceivable that someday, years from now, Joe Heller, maybe, he may have had it by then, he may have written another novel and come to somebody for a blurb, and the blurb might say, Joe Heller has written the 17th funniest book ever published, or something to that effect. At any rate, as I said, the plot was so complex, no normal person could understand it, so David Merrick promptly bought it as a Broadway musical. He not only bought the book, but he was so enchanted with it that he bought me as an actor. And I thanked him for this, like an idiot, because this is the worst involvement a human being can possibly make. I spent another year and 9 months rewriting the damn book as a stage play. And if you ever are given the opportunity to adapt your own novel for the stage, don't do it, because there's nothing more painful than seeing someone else cut your story to ribbons, unless it's you doing it yourself. It's kind of like performing your own appendectomy, without anesthesia. At this moment, an unfortunate team of, a lyricist and a composer are being inveigled into writing the music for it, and some poor hapless director is being chased around New York with a contract. So if all goes well, and we all survive, and I can finally, boil the plot down to where it makes some sense, we should be on the boards, as we say in the theater, sometime next season. Not this coming, but next season. Speaking of David Merrick, I don't know how many of you know who he is. I feel his name's a household word because, we use it in my household when we're angry at each other. But I'd always heard very terrible things about the man, his lack of human feelings, his lust for gold, and his insufferably dull personality. Well, I've worked with him rather intimately now for 2 years, and it's absolutely true. 15 minutes with David Merrick is like 3 days at a Tab Hunter film festival. He's very, very hard to take. But I've done a few nasty things to him, too. He thinks I'm very arbitrary, which I am. I'm arbitrary. A couple of months ago, he called my agent to ask for an extension to the option. It was a technicality he had the right to exercise, and my agent said, certainly, but we want some more money. And Merrick said, more money? He said, I've already given that so-and-so the money that I was going to buy a Rolls-Royce with. Well, a couple of weeks later, Merrick had occasion to call me on the same question. He wanted to extend the option, and I said, certainly, David, if, you give me some more money. He said, more money? He says, what the hell did you do with the money I gave you? I said, I bought a Rolls-Royce with it, David. Which I didn't really. I was just torturing him a little. Well, if there's any point to all this, it frankly eludes me, except to illustrate how a couple of lousy little guilt feelings can change your life, you see. It changed my life from this almost idyllic 2 to 3 day work week to its present 10 or 12-hour, 6-day week. Dr. Palatella told you what I'm doing concurrently, and I'm doing all these things at once, incidentally, so I won't burden you with it again. But as I said a lot earlier, I wasn't always a novelist, or a playwright, or a television writer. I was always a cartoonist. I've been drawing them since the age of 4. At the age of 12, I accidentally discovered that people get paid for drawing cartoons, and it's been my obsession ever since. Getting paid has that. But as a comic strip artist, you're asked funny questions, and they're the same questions all the time. There are 3 questions that are most often asked, and the most fascinating from the questioner's standpoint, it seems, is how far ahead do you work? Why they want to know this, I can't imagine, but they do. The second question is where do you get your ideas, which is somewhat more interesting. The third, the comic strip artist, how does he get started? Well, I'll start with the third. The would-be comic strip artist simply draws 3 or 4 weeks of this idea he's got, and he submits a sample strips to what we call a newspaper syndicate, a newspaper feature syndicate. Well, you know what that is, I'm sure. As some of you are journalism students, I think. It's obviously an organization devoted to the promotion, sale, and distribution of features to newspapers. Unfortunately, though, these days, the term syndicate has another connotation, less pleasant. It conjures up a vision of a group of bad men, nefariously organized in their own selfish interests. Well, this is a pretty good description of the people I work for. I've referred to them very often as a kind of an Anglo-Saxon mafia. But in exchange for their services, the syndicate, every syndicate, and with almost every cartoonist, takes 50% of the gross receipts, which is a big cut. Agents, literary agents get 10. Actors, managers get 25%. Thieves get 40. Syndicates get 50. The first question was, how far ahead do you work? Now, I'm required by contract to stay 8 weeks ahead of publication. Now, this gives the syndicate time to mechanically process the strips, that is to make the plates and the mats and mail them out to the subscribers. A process which takes about 72 hours at the most, see? But they insist upon 8 weeks in which to do it. It also gives them time to replace me if I should die, or worse, just get sick. They'd be a lot better off if I simply croaked. Then they'd have no problems. They'd go out and get some hack to replace me. On the other hand, if I got terribly ill, they'd be hard put to make me feel better and send me flowers and candy and do all the nice things that they're emotionally unequipped to do. Also, the 8-week advance period gives them time to do something that they seem to do with an incredible frequency, namely, lose the drawings. It's practically a prerequisite. When you set up a syndicate office, you've got to install these big old-fashioned radiators behind which they can lose the drawings. They're not lost forever. They find them after you've redrawn them. Then, and only then, some syndicate editor or a file clerk or a secretary or a charwoman even is honor-bound by this age-old custom to find the drawings behind the radiator, rush joyfully to the telephone, call you, and tell you that she's found them. Then it's your turn to say something. The second question was, where do you get your ideas? Well, the answer is we steal them, obviously. Well, we do. Not from each other, but ideas don't come out of thin air. They come from conversation and everyday situation. And this is the real grist for the cartoonist Mill. Talk. Either to him or by him or overheard by him or around him or about him. But talk is what, from the stuff from which jump these little fragments of ideas, not full-blown ideas, but little germs which later are unconsciously refined in a marvelous process, by the way, into full-blown usable ideas. The half-baked notion I get on Monday could conceivably turn up on Thursday as a very good idea or a fairly good idea or a rotten idea, but an idea nonetheless. And it all goes on unconsciously. At least the hard work does. Well, speaking of ideas, Miss Peach runs in 200 papers around the country, one or two in Europe and Australia. And it deals with the rather idiotic adventures of a young, a bunch of school kids, a classroom full of kids, who are desperately trying to educate their teacher. The education isn't taking, of course. Now, the fact that this comic strip takes place in a school, which I call the Kelly School, isn't really important. What is important is that the kids represent a group of miniature adults who function in a miniature world. The Kelly School is kind of a microcosm of the world at large. Now, the reason I chose the school, the classroom, as a background for my comic strip is because it gave me the widest possible latitude in terms of ideas. And it also keeps the characters together in a set little community. When I started the strip 8 years ago, I remembered a writer's axiom. I used a comic strip writer's axiom when I started writing my novel. When I started the strip, I remembered an author's axiom which says that characters make your story. The main thing when you're writing fiction for any medium is to create characters with whom the reader will instantly identify, either themselves or anyone else that they secretly despise. The main thing when you're writing fiction for any medium is to create characters with whom the reader will instantly identify, either themselves or anyone else that they secretly despise. In the case of my own characters, I based them on real people, close personal friends of mine, who rapidly became former friends. Recently I was asked to speak before a group of advertising men in New York whose job it was to create characters for use in continuing advertising campaigns. And they wanted to know how the warm, friendly appeal of comic strip characters could most effectively be used in mass communication. Well, the fact is, anyone who's ever read Miss Peach knows that I don't know the meaning of the words warm and friendly. My characters are ugly, hostile little savages who spend most of their time tormenting each other. Now, this isn't bad, see, because what gives your average reader more honest-to-goodness pleasure than seeing someone else tormented and humiliated? In other words, if you can appeal to the reader's baser instincts without being called dirty or sadistic, then you've got it made. As a case in point, Mickey Mouse, for example. Now, Mickey Mouse was Walt Disney's first important character. It lasted for, 20 or 25 years that I can remember. He's a positive character, see. He was a sweet, nice creature. And he was replaced in very short order by Donald Duck, who was a negative character. He's an irascible, irritable, angry little beast. And he took the play away from Mickey Mouse. I think it proves something. I don't know what. Now, with your permission, or even without it, I'm going to draw some of my characters and tell you a little bit about what makes them tick. Should I put this on? Yeah, why not? Oh, excuse me. Probably either hang myself or be electrocuted. Neither of which is a particularly bad idea. First of all, we have, of course, Miss Peach herself. Can you hear me now? Huh? Am I coming? Okay. I want to get this closer so I can lean on the thing here. Miss Peach herself is the heroine, the star, the title character. But she's really not terribly important. She has been relegated through time to the position of kind of a supporting actress. The reason is, as I pointed out before, she's too damn nice. You know, she's a sweet thing. She's the only character that is not based, incidentally, on a real person. She's warm and sweet and kind and gentle and tolerant. In other words, a complete fiction. She looks something like this. She looks exactly like this. This thing buried in a skull is not a weapon, it's a pencil. And the fact that it looks like something else is a commentary on the way I draw. I was never trained, actually, in art, not formally. And I think it's apparent. She's usually seated at a desk because I never learned how to draw feet. Now, as I say, she has been reduced to this strange phenomenon known as the character taking over and taking the story away from you to the role of a secondary character. But she is sort of a catalyst. She functions in that way. She starts things off, and then the kids take it, and then she recedes into the background, and they do the whatever is done. They make the joke, so to speak. It's an interesting phenomenon, too, by the way, and I've observed it with continuing wonder and experienced it, too. The way characters will become very real to the writer and is there a feedback with the two mics? And tend to resist things that he tries to do with them. I couldn't make her do or say anything uncharacteristic in the strip without, a great emotional turmoil, and I don't need emotional turmoil. There were characters in the strip at the very beginning characters that I thought were going to be very important. They had names and little personalities and, distinctive faces and all that, and they just never lasted, through no fault of my own. There was a little boy, whom I called Freddie, who was kind of smart and a little snide, and he was a good character because he got all the good punchlines. And he was replaced eventually by a little girl who was also clever and snide, but had the added advantage of being nasty. And she he just disappeared. I don't know where the hell he is today. He's probably working in another comic strip. The real stars of the strip, as I say, are the kids. Oh, we're in trouble. I'm going to have to turn these over the top, and I didn't realize it. Well, I'll tear them off. The kids themselves are the real heroes and heroines, especially a little girl, the one that replaced Freddie I was telling you about a moment ago, whom I call Marcia Mason. Now, she's the class tyrant, and she looks like this. Yeah, she's, kind of mean, and she runs everything in the school, all the vice and the social activities. She is what psychologists would refer to, if they were speaking clinically, as a bitch. Now, she's based on a real kid with whom I went to school. And yeah, she was, as a matter of fact. This kid was a superiority complex with legs. She used to brag, for example, as a tot, that her former pediatrician dragged her around town as a sample. Now, she's only 10 years old, but she happens to be the world's most vicious woman. She takes credit, incidentally, or will take credit in the strip in about 3 weeks or 2 weeks for the creation of an organization which she claims is destined to appear on every college campus in the country. She calls it the Student Violent Non-Coordinated Committee. Recently, in Miss Peach, in the strip, Marcia walked over to a peace-loving little classmate and asked him if he would lend her some money, and he said, "I'm sorry, I'm broke." Well, she hauled off and hit him in the teeth. And when he recovered, he said, what was that all about? And she said, "That was the opening gun in my war on poverty." Now she's actually, according to the mail, she's the most, she's very well liked by men readers, and I feel that the reason is that they can resent her instead of their wives, see, and not feel guilty about it. And women like her because she does what many women try to do unconsciously all the time, namely emasculate the men around her. She does this magnificently, not literally, mind you, emotionally. They don't actually admit they like her. They say, as a matter of fact, they say, we hate her. You know, get her out of the strip or I'm going to stop reading it. Incidentally, can you please send me an 8 by 10 picture of her? Now, another example of a character with whom I've had success in terms of reader response is a little boy I call Ira. He's Marcia's classmate, one of them, and her fiancé. And he is just as despicable as she is, but for entirely different reasons. He's a coward. He's a class coward, a pathological sissy. This is Ira. At this point, they all look alike. See the upturned eyebrows, which is a cheap cartoonist trick to denote fear and tension, and the quivering lips. Now, as I say, he's engaged to, another little cartoonist trick, the bead of perspiration, which indicates either, deep tension or fear or he's warm, that's all. He doesn't have the courage to break his engagement. He's not happy about it. She won him in a raffle, see. It was discovered by the girls that he had $1.35 in the school bank. This is the way it actually worked. And they raffled him off, and Marcia won, mainly because she's very lucky, and also she ran the raffle. She organized it. And now she feels, they're going to be married in about 15 years, and her theory, she's insisting that he divorce himself from all associations, phase out all his other relationships, so to speak, so that when the 15 years rolls around, without having had any friends or human contact, he'll be reduced to a simpering, witless hulk, perfect husband material. Now, I don't really identify myself with any of the characters in this strip. Oh yeah, before I forget, speaking of human relations, Marcia conducts periodically human relations lectures on a soapbox, and she gives marvelous advice to her classmates, typical of which advice is something that she did recently in the strip. She's on the floor. A kid got up after she'd spoken, apparently, and said, how do you, Marcia, how do you make it with people? How do you get people to respond to you and to do as you would like them to do? And she said, always remember as you go through life that you get more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And then she adds, so much for attracting insects. She says, with people, threats and coercion work wonders. Now, as I said, I wouldn't identify myself with any of these characters, but probably the one that I most closely resemble physically, that is a kid, called Skinny Lester. It may surprise you to learn that I used to be very thin. You're not surprised. As a kid, I took a terrible beating because I was thin. Well, you know the scene. You hate to go to the beach because of your legs and all that. I still suffer, from the same complex, but I pretend it doesn't bother me anymore. But as a kid, it hurt me deeply, and I now have a character in the strip to whom I do the same things that were done to me, and this is why I'm so well balanced today. I'll draw you his picture. Oops. Now, he's a nice kid. He's sweet, and he's likable, and he's brave, and all that. except that he's terribly skinny. And you might ask, well, how could my readership possibly like a kid who's reasonably nice? And the answer, of course, I think is obvious. The fact that he's so terribly skinny is just another way in which they feel superior to him. He reminds me, incidentally, of an incident in my youth. See, from the neck up, he looks all right. Reminds me of something that happened to me as a young boy, about 150 years ago. Do any of you remember the Charles Atlas ads? Fortunately, you're too young. I was going to say unfortunately. No, they were the first successful example of comic strip advertising techniques. But what they were selling, of course, was a bodybuilding course, and they were on the backs of these borderline magazines, the back covers, along with the ads for the rupture trusses and hormone creams and ties that glow in the dark. And these ads were classics, really, and to this day, you don't see them so much, but they're talked about by us older folks. And they were always the same format. It was a comic strip format, and the first picture, first panel, would see the hero, who is a skinny, emaciated wretch, sitting on the beach with a beautiful girl in a polka dot bathing suit. Along comes a very muscular bully, see, and he says, and this is the exact dialogue, I'll never forget it. He says, "Har, har, har, I kick sand in your face," and he kicks sand in the hero's face. In the next panel, he's walking off with the girl, the bully is. And the hero is crying. In the next picture, the hero is home, and he's reading a magazine, holding a magazine, and kicking over a chair, and he's saying, "Doggone it, I am not going to have sand kicked in my face anymore. I'm going to send in this coupon to Charles Atlas," which he does. And in the next panel, and last, presumably the next week, he's back on the beach, rippling with muscle, see? And the bully is seated on the sand with the same girl in the same polka dot bathing suit, and he comes up to the bully and says, "Har, har, har, now I kick sand in your face," which he does. The bully runs off, and our hero reclaims the girl. Personally, I felt she wasn't for him to begin with, but he wanted her. Okay. Now, as a kid, well, they sold a lot of bodybuilding courses. It was called Dynamic Tension. As a kid, I was a sucker for these things, and this is the first and last one that I ever really invested in. I actually subscribed. And today, incidentally, and this I'm sure is libelous, but I'm a graduate of the Charles Atlas School of Dynamic Tension and have a garage hanging in my diploma at home. But the thing that got me about it was the dunning letters that I got at the end of the course when I didn't send him the last $3. I was supposed to send him $3 a week. And I just didn't have it, and I wasn't terribly happy with the results. So I kind of neglected the last $3. And I got a series of 12 or 10 dunning letters from the Charles Atlas organization, and they were all on a beautiful engraved letterhead with a halftone of Atlas himself, smiling benignly, with the muscles flexed in a loincloth. And the language and the tenor of the letter the first few letters were very friendly and pleasant. He would say, they were forms, by the way. Hoovenized, they called them those days. They would say, "Dear Melvin," which is my maiden name. Melvin was typed in. See, always a little cockeyed. "Dear Melvin, how are your muscles? Hope you're doing fine, etc. By the way, my accountant tells me that you owe us $3. Why don't you, $3 is typed in. Why don't you send in the money?" Okay. A couple letters go by. Still haven't sent him the money. And I swear to you, not only did the language change, but the face on that halftone changed. The expression. And the letters became something like this. He would say, "Dear Lazarus, how about that $3, huh? Do you want I should come into your neighborhood?" They were slightly illiterate, by the way. I forget who the agency was. "Do you want I should come into your neighborhood and I should shake your hand, and you should call me Charlie, and I should call you Melvin, or not?" The "not" implying, of course, that if he could come into my neighborhood and shake my hand, he could just as easily wrench the arm from the body, right? I still didn't send him the $3, which is a great tribute to this day to my extreme poverty. What did get the money out of me, though, was when the very last letter, in which another department entirely wrote, see, it wasn't a legal department anymore. They reminded me that I hadn't gotten my graduation gift from him. And I'd forgotten about those, see? Now, the graduation gifts were supposed to be a money belt. And you don't know what a money belt is, but they were very popular just before World War II, I think it was. They were worn a lot by servicemen and civilians. In those days, you could get mugged and beaten up and robbed. You know, it wasn't like it is today. But you wore them under your shirt, and you had your money in it. You kept your money and valuables in it. Well, it was a money belt and a set of books on sex hygiene. Well, I shot that $3 into him so fast because at the age of 14, I desperately needed that money belt. At any rate, so much for Lester. Every class has its cerebral giant, its class wizard. When I was a schoolboy, we had ours, and it was not me. We had a kid who was only popular for 5 minutes during the day, and that was when, in the period we called between the bells. The first bell, which signaled the start of the school day, and the second bell 5 minutes later, which meant the class was about to begin. During those 5 minutes, he was frantically beseeched by the non-homeworkers, like me, for a copy of last night's assignment, which he would come through with, you know, after a long, sanctimonious lecture on the sins of procrastination. But he looked a little like this. He wore eyeglasses, which everyone knows is a sign of superior intellect. And if it isn't, we cartoonists are in a hell of a lot of trouble. His name was Stewart, as I said, or didn't I? But I once had a little experience with him as a kid, and this actually happened, in which I approached him and begged him for a copy of last night's assignment, and I said, I didn't have time to do it. And he said, why didn't you have time to do your homework last night? And I secretly felt it was none of his business, so I said, well, I was sitting in my bedroom, and a fairy princess came down on a white couch drawn by 8 unicorns, and she swept me away and took me to a magic ball, and we danced and danced and danced all night, and I didn't get home till very late. Well, he looked at me. He incidentally had no sense of humor. Looked at me for a minute, and he gave me the homework rather begrudgingly, but he was fascinated by the story. And while I was copying the assignment, he said, Melvin, he said, tonight you better do your homework. I said, okay, of course, but you know why? He says, because tonight I dance. In all fairness, though, he wasn't really a bad kid. We needed him, you know, to raise the class average. Now, by all odds, the most popular kid in the strip, according to the mail that's addressed to him personally, he gets more mail than I do, actually, is a kid called Arthur, who is not stupid. He just isn't very bright. Yeah, I think you know the type. I mean, he goes to school, but not actively. He considers himself kind of an associate member of the class, and he's engaged in everything, but he's not involved in anything. For instance, on the track team, he'll be a cinder scatterer, or in the glee club, he's a listener. On the swimming team, he's a non-swimmer. But he's lovable, see? He's a nice kid. He's honest and loyal and brave and beloved by one and all, because he is so incredibly dumb that anybody feels superior to him. And that's honestly why I think readers like him. Well, hell, they feel like $1 million seeing the things that he does. The things that the real author, though, did, the kid that I patterned him after, are much more incredible than anything I've ever been able to invent for this kid. For instance, he was absent from school one day, and on the following day, when he came back, the teacher said, I want you to bring a letter from home tomorrow, if you follow that sequence. Tomorrow came, and Arthur walked in and handed her a letter, and she opened it and read it, and it was on a letterhead of Macy's department store, and it said, Dear Mrs. Strim, which was Arthur's mother's name, it seems, according to our records, that you still owe us $345 for the living room set. If you don't pay us, we're going to turn the matter over to our attorneys and, throw you in jail. The teacher was shocked, and she said, Arthur, why on earth did you bring this letter from home. He said it was the only one I could find. I think what I'd like to do now is, if I can get these things organized again, is give each of these characters a little bit of dialogue, which will result in a king-sized comic strip. It'll be terribly funny. It'll be big, anyway. I can't promise you that it'll be funny. Well, I've got to do it in a certain order, see, because that's the way I memorized it. Oh, swell. Thanks a lot. But I'll tell you what, I think I could manage it this way. I think it'd be just as easy. It'd take a lot less time than typing them all up. Oh, this will be fine. Thank you, though. No, I don't. Miss Peach, as usual, as usual, gets the first line. She throws the ball out for the kids to run with. And we need a little prop here. In this case, it's a fish tank. These are fish, and these are plants. And on the plants are sticky little things. There are always sticky little things on aquarium plants. And Miss Peach says, I'll read it out loud when I'm finished for the benefit of you older folks. She says, these sticky little things are fish eggs, class. And you draw a balloon around it, which is what you call the thing that holds the words in the comic strip bracket. Now, can I have a volunteer, please, to hold this, to come up here and make a complete spectacle of yourself? One of those young ladies? Fine. Either one, or... It's impossible to get on the stage. I'm sorry. I should have told you. That's the one mistake they made. No, there's a stairway over there. Thank you. I think maybe you ought to come from down below. It'll take a lot less time in the future, which is right now. Thank you. Would you mind holding this and standing over there? Now, Marcia, if I can find her, says... it's the next line. Oh, yeah. And she says, fish eggs? I thought only birds lay eggs. Now, can we have another victim, please? This little lady? Thank you. She's not, is she? I'm sorry. Forgive me, I have no case. Would you stand to the left of that young lady, please? Who was next? Oh yeah. Ira gets the next line. I don't think he can top the last one. He says, He says, oh no, fish and bugs lay eggs too. And who's next now? I think Lester. Yeah. Thank you. Lester says, and frogs also. Why don't the next two volunteers start coming up now? Because I'm down to two more, I think. Thank you. Swell. Good. Thank you, dear. And then Stuart says, see why we hated him? He says, and even a certain mammal, the duck-billed platypus, lays eggs. Thank you. A little bit like commencement, doesn't it? Thanks. And then Arthur, of course, gets the punchline, as he very often does. And he says, what the hell does he say? Yeah. Oh, yeah. He says, really, I had no idea it was getting so popular. Thank you. And thereby hangs a king-size comic strip. And thank you. Incidentally, thank you. Do you remember what I said earlier about people unconsciously identifying with certain characters for no earthly apparent reason? What do you think of my case in point here? Thanks. Thanks a lot. That's it. I'm through. Thank you very much.